I am Irfan. Welcome to our detective channel, where every mystery has a secret waiting to be uncovered. The Black Wedding Cake, a Hercule Poirot mystery.
Chapter 1. The Widow's Wedding. Ravenshade Hall had never been a cheerful house, but on the evening of Lady Evelina Harcourt's second wedding, it seemed almost determined to prove it. It stood at the edge of the Wiltshire Downs, a great old house of dark stone and narrow windows, with ivy climbing its walls, like something that wished to enter rather than decorate. Rain had fallen since morning. By dusk, the gravel drive shone like wet silver beneath the carriage lamps, and the yew trees lining the avenue bowed and stirred in the wind like black-robed mourners. Inside, however, everything had been prepared with faultless elegance. The long gallery glowed with candles. White flowers had been arranged in tall crystal vases. The old portraits of the Harcourt family had been dusted, though no one could say they looked improved by it, of golden daffodils. Their painted eyes stared down upon the wedding guests with the same cold judgment they had given to christenings, funerals, bankruptcies, and quarrels for nearly 200 years. Yet, despite the flowers, the music, and the polished silver, no one, entering Ravenshade that evening, could have mistaken the occasion for happiness. There were only 14 guests. That alone gave the wedding the air of a private verdict. Lady Evelina Harcourt had insisted upon a small ceremony in the family chapel, followed by supper in the old ballroom. She had refused the village church, refused a morning service, refused a public reception, and most of all, refused to wear white. She came down the staircase shortly after 7 o'clock in a gown of deep ivory satin, so pale it almost looked silver in the candlelight. Around her shoulders lay a veil of black lace, delicate as smoke. She was 42, perhaps 45, though no one ever agreed on her age. She had the kind of beauty that did not invite warmth. Her face was calm, narrow, and composed, with dark eyes that seemed to have learned long ago that tears were a waste of dignity. At her throat she wore a single pearl. On her right hand, above her wedding glove, gleamed a mourning ring set with a piece of black enamel. Several guests noticed it. Only one man smiled. That man was Hercule Poirot. He stood near the marble fireplace in the ballroom, immaculate in evening dress, his small, shining shoes placed precisely upon the polished floor. His famous moustaches were arranged with military perfection. His eyes, green and alert, took in the room, the flowers, the servants, the positions of the guests, and finally Lady Evelina's ring. Beside him, Colonel Arthur Blenheim muttered, "Queer business, this. Damned queer." Poirot turned his head slightly. "You object to weddings, Colonel?" "I object to this one," said Blenheim. He was a red-faced man with tired blue eyes, and the stiff bearings on one who had once commanded men, and now commanded only his own temper. A woman should not marry again in the house where her first husband died. "Ah," said Poirot softly. "Then it is not the marriage that troubles you, it is the memory." The colonel did not answer. Across the room, the bridegroom was laughing. Mr. Julian Vale was younger than Lady Evelina, by nearly 12 years, handsome in a polished theatrical way. He had fair hair brushed neatly back, a fine profile, and a smile that arrived just a fraction too quickly. He moved among the guests with the ease of a man who believed himself admired, though admiration was not precisely what followed him that evening. His sister, Beatrice Vale, stood near the windows, watching him with a pale, strained face. She was a thin woman in a severe green dress, with restless fingers and eyes that seemed always on the edge of accusation. "You see how she looks at him," murmured a voice near Poirot. It belonged to Mrs. Celia Ashcombe, Lady Evelina's oldest friend. She was soft, plump, and gentle-looking, but her eyes were intelligent. "Poor Beatrice. She thinks Evelina has stolen him." "And has she?" asked Poirot. Mrs. Ashcombe gave him a quick glance. "That depends on whether Julian was ever anyone's to steal." Before Poirot could reply, the doors opened and the servants began to move into the ballroom. A quiet change passed through the guests. The wedding supper, had been laid with old Harcourt silver, white linen, and pale roses. The chandeliers burned above the table, casting gold over crystal glasses and polished knives. Everything was beautiful. Everything was correct. Except the cake. It stood alone on a round table at the far end of the ballroom, beneath the largest portrait of the late Sir Edmund Harcourt. For a moment no one spoke. The cake was 3 tiers high, black as morning silk, smooth as lacquer, and decorated not with sugar blossoms of white or pink, but with silver roses that climbed its sides in frozen spirals. At the top, instead of bride and groom figures, there stood a tiny silver wreath. The thing was magnificent. It was also dreadful. One of the younger guests gave a nervous little laugh, then stopped at once. Julian Vale turned toward his bride. "My dear Evelina," he said, lightly enough, "you have surpassed yourself." Lady Evelina did not smile. "It is only a cake." "No," said Poirot quietly, though no one heard him. "It is never only a cake." The butler Hemsley stepped forward with champagne. The old man's face was pale and carefully blank, but his hands trembled slightly as he filled the glasses. Poirot noticed this. He also noticed that Mrs. Mirel, the housekeeper, stood rigid near the door, her black dress severe, her lips pressed into a hard line. Dr. Lionel Graves, the family physician, lifted his glass first. "To Lady Evelina and Mr. Julian Vale," he said. His voice was dry, formal, almost reluctant. "May the past rest quietly, and the future prove kinder." It was not a happy toast, but the guests drank. Julian lifted his glass higher than the rest. "To my beautiful wife," he said, turning to Lady Evelina with that bright, careless smile. "And to Ravenshade Hall. May it learn to welcome me." A sound came then from somewhere outside. A branch scraping against the window, perhaps, or the wind pressing its wet hands against the glass. Lady Evelina's face did not change. Julian drank. Then he touched the white rose pinned to his lapel. It was a small gesture, nothing more. His fingers brushed the petals, then his lips, as though smoothing away the taste of champagne. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The groom laughed once. "Well," he said, "shall we cut this monstrous masterpiece?" He took one step toward the black wedding cake, then another. Then the glass slipped from his hand. It struck the polished floor and shattered with a sharp, bright sound. Julian Vale put one hand to his throat. For the first time that evening, his smile vanished completely. His eyes widened, not in pain at first, but in astonishment, as if some private certainty had betrayed him. "Julian," cried Beatrice. He tried to speak. No words came. His knees gave way. Lady Evelina did not move. The black lace of her veil lay still against her shoulders. She watched her new husband fall at her feet, with a face so pale and composed that several guests later swore she had known it would happen. Dr. Graves rushed forward. Beatrice screamed. Colonel Blenheim swore under his breath. Mrs. Ashcombe covered her mouth with both hands, and at the far end of the room, beneath the portrait of the dead Sir Edmund, the black wedding cake waited untouched. Hercule Poirot did not go at once to the body. He looked first at Lady Evelina, then at the shattered glass, then at the white rose on the dead bridegroom's lapel. And very softly, almost sadly, he said, "Ah, so it begins. Chapter 2. A death before dessert." For several seconds after Julian Vale fell, the ballroom ceased to be a room full of people, and became only a room full of sound. Beatrice Vale's scream rose above everything, high, thin, and terrible. A chair overturned. Someone dropped a spoon. The wind flung rain against the tall windows, and the candles shivered in their silver branches as though even the flames had drawn breath in shock. Dr. Lionel Graves knelt beside the fallen bridegroom with the practiced speed of a man who had attended death too often. He loosened Julian's collar, pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw, then leaned close to listen for breath. "Stand back," he said sharply. No one obeyed at once. Guests gathered and recoiled in the same movement, drawn by horror and repelled by it. Lady Evelina Harcourt remained where she was, a pale figure in ivory satin and black lace, one gloved hand resting lightly against the edge of the supper table. She did not faint, she did not cry out, she did not even lower her eyes. That composure condemned her before any accusation was spoken. "Julian!" Beatrice pushed past Colonel Blenheim and dropped to her knees, reaching for her brother's hand. Dr. Graves caught her wrist. "Do not touch him." She stared at him as if he had struck her. "He is my brother." "And he may be a victim of poison," said the doctor. The word went through the room like a match touched to dry paper. Poison. At once, every eye turned toward the black wedding cake. It stood beneath Sir Edmund Harcourt's portrait, grand and dark and untouched. Its silver roses gleamed under the chandelier. The tiny wreath upon the top caught the candlelight. Cold and funereal, someone whispered. "The cake," another voice answered, but he had not eaten it. It was meant for him. It was meant for all of us. It is cursed. At that, Mrs. Mirel, the housekeeper, crossed herself so quickly that she seemed ashamed of the movement the moment she had made it. Hercule Poirot noticed. He had not moved into the centre of the chaos. He had remained near the edge of it. Not from indifference, but he preferred to see the whole pattern before stepping upon the threads. His eyes travelled from the body to the bride, from the bride to the sister, from the sister to the doctor, and then to the servants gathered by the door. The butler, Hemsley, looked ill. The maid beside him was crying silently. Mrs. Mirel stood like a black pillar, but there was a strange brightness in her eyes. Not grief exactly, nor surprise. Recognition, perhaps. Poirot turned to Colonel Blenheim. "You will be so kind as to close the doors." The colonel stared. "What?" "The doors, mon ami. No one leaves this room until we understand better what has occurred." "Good God, Poirot, are you saying this is murder?" Poirot's gaze flicked toward the body. "I am saying only that healthy men do not commonly die between a toast and the cutting of a wedding cake." Colonel Blenheim hesitated, then strode to the ballroom doors and shut them with a heavy sound. That sound steadied the room more than any speech could have done. The guests turned, frightened and resentful, toward Poirot. In another house, among another company, someone might have objected to a small Belgian gentleman assuming command, but this was Hercule Poirot, and even those who disliked him had heard enough to fear his intelligence. Dr. Graves rose slowly. "Well?" asked Beatrice, her voice shaking. "Is he alive?" The doctor's face answered before he did. "No." Beatrice made a broken sound and bent over Julian's body, but still did not touch him. Her grief was raw, ugly, uncontrolled. It stripped her of all the hard bitterness she had worn earlier, and left only a woman staring at the impossible. Lady Evelina closed her eyes for one brief moment. Poirot saw it. When she opened them again, they were dry. "How did he die?" she asked. There was no tremor in her voice. Beatrice turned on her with sudden violence. "Do not speak as though you were asking about the weather." Lady Evelina looked at her. "I am asking because he was my husband. For 10 minutes. For 10 minutes, said Lady Evelina. He was still my husband. The words, calmly spoken, had a curious effect. They did not soften the room. If anything, they made it colder. Dr. Graves cleared his throat. "I cannot say yet. There are signs consistent with a rapid poison, but I will not make a formal judgment without examination." "The champagne," said Marcus Fenwick. He had been standing at the far side of the table, a narrow, polished man with sleek hair and a lawyer's watchful expression. He now pointed toward the broken glass on the floor. He drank the champagne just before he collapsed. "So did we all," said Mrs. Ashcombe faintly. "Not from his glass," Fenwick replied. "Ah," said Poirot. It was a small sound, but it stopped the room. He approached the shattered glass, but did not touch it. The champagne had spread across the floorboards in a pale stain. A few bubbles still clung to one broken fragment. "Hemsley," said Poirot, without looking up. "Who poured the champagne?" The butler swallowed. "I did, sir." "From one bottle?" "No, sir. 2 bottles. Who received from the bottle that served Mr. Vale?" Hemsley's eyes darted around the room. "Mr. Vale, Lady Evelina, Miss Vale, Dr. Graves, and Mr. Fenwick, sir, I believe. You believe? The old butler flushed. There was some movement at the table, sir. There is always movement where there is guilt, said Poirot mildly, and also where there is bad service. We shall distinguish between the two. A few guests looked shocked. Under different circumstances, the remark might have raised a smile. Tonight it only deepened the discomfort. Test the champagne, Beatrice demanded. Test the cake. Test everything. The cake? Poirot turned toward it at last. Yes, the cake. Her eyes blazed. Look at it, she ordered that thing. Black icing, silver wreath, like a funeral offering. She wanted everyone to think of death. Lady Evelina's face remained still. I did order it. A ripple moved through the guests. Poirot looked at her. Why, madame? Because white would have been ridiculous. Ridiculous. My first wedding was white. White roses, white silk, white favours tied to every carriage. 3 months later, my husband was dead at the foot of the south staircase. She turned her head slightly, and for the first time that evening, something old and wounded touched her expression. I have no talent for pretending innocence twice. No one spoke. The rain pressed harder against the glass. Poirot studied her with grave attention. That is a very interesting answer. Beatrice gave a harsh laugh. Interesting? My brother is dead, and you are discussing taste in confectionery. No, mademoiselle, said Poirot, and now his voice sharpened. I am discussing theatre. Your brother died in a room prepared like a stage. The cake, the veil, the black ring, the toast to the past, all of it draws the eye in one direction. When a murder is theatrical, one must ask, who benefits from the audience looking at the wrong thing? Marcus Fenwick shifted. It was not much, only a slight adjustment of his cuffs, but Poirot noticed the nervous precision of it. Dr. Graves said, The police must be sent for. Certainly, said Poirot, but until they arrive, I ask that nothing is disturbed. He moved closer to the body now and knelt with great care, his knees bending with the neatness of a man accustomed to respecting both crime, scenes and trousers. Julian Vale lay on his side, one hand half curled near his throat. His face had taken on a faint greyish pallor. His lips were parted slightly. Poirot did not touch the mouth, nor the collar, nor the hand. He looked at the lapel. The white rose still sat there, delicate and innocent-looking against the dark cloth of Julian's evening coat. Its petals were damp at the edges, though no rain had touched it. One petal was faintly crushed. Poirot leaned nearer. Not enough to smell it, only enough to see. Curious, he murmured. Doctor. Graves bent beside him. What is curious? The flowers of the room are pale roses. The flowers upon the cake are silver roses. The bride carries no bouquet, and yet Monsieur Vile wears a white rose in his buttonhole. That is hardly remarkable, said Fenwick. A groom may wear a flower. Indeed, said Poirot. But from where did it come? Lady Evelina answered. Not from me. All eyes turned to her. I did not give him that flower, she said. Beatrice rose slowly from beside the body. Her tears had stopped. Then who did? No one answered. Poirot straightened and looked round the ballroom. He saw fear now, but not only fear. In one face there was anger, in another calculation, in another a memory so painful it had become almost physical. At last Mrs. Mirel spoke from the doorway. Her voice was low. There were white roses in this house once. Lady Evelina turned sharply. Mirel. But the housekeeper's eyes remained fixed on the flower in Julian Vale's lapel. For Sir Edmund, she said. Always for Sir Edmund. The silence that followed was deeper than the first. Above the black wedding cake, the painted face of the dead, Sir Edmund Harcourt, seemed to look down upon them all with cold, aristocratic satisfaction. Poirot folded his hands over the head of his cane. So, he said softly, this is not only the death of Monsieur Vale, it is the return of Sir Edmund. Chapter 3. The Guests Who Came to Witness. By the time the police were sent for, Ravenshade Hall had changed its character. An hour earlier, it had been a wedding house pretending not to mourn. Now it was a house under accusation, The candles still burned in the ballroom. The champagne still stood in crystal glasses. The silver still shone beneath the chandeliers. But nothing appeared festive any longer. Beauty had become evidence. Every flower seemed placed with intention. Every glance felt overheard. Julian Vale's body had been carried, under Dr. Graves's supervision, to the small library adjoining the ballroom. Poirot had insisted that the white rose remain untouched upon his lapel, until it could be properly examined. This instruction had produced a tremor in the room, as though the little flower had become more frightening than the corpse itself. The guests were moved to the drawing-room. It was a long, sombre chamber with blue velvet curtains, a marble fireplace, and too many mirrors. In the flames, every face looked older. Lady Evelina sat nearest the fire, her black lace veil removed now, and folded across her lap like a dead bird. She had taken off her gloves. The mourning ring remained upon her right hand. Beatrice Vale stood by the window, one hand gripping the curtain, though the glass reflected only the room behind her. She stared into it, as if she expected to see her brother walking through the rain. Marcus Fenwick sat with one ankle crossed over the other, trying to appear composed and failing because of his hands. His fingers kept touching his cufflinks, his watch chain, his collar. Small, polished gestures performed too often. Mrs. Celia Ashcombe remained quietly on the sofa, her handkerchief pressed between her palms. Colonel Blenheim paced in short, angry lines before the fireplace. Dr. Graves had returned from the library with the air of a man who had brought death in on the soles of his shoes. Poirot stood beneath a portrait of a Harcourt child, holding a dead falcon. He looked pleased with nobody. "Let us begin," he said, "not with accusations, but with truth. It is sometimes less dramatic, but far more useful." Beatrice turned from the window. "The truth is that my brother married that woman and was dead before the cake was cut." Lady Evelina did not look at her. "You warned him not to marry me." "Yes," repeatedly. "Yes, and yet he did." Beatrice's face tightened, because Julian never understood danger when it smiled at him. Poirot watched her carefully. "You thought Lady Evelina dangerous. I thought this house dangerous." Her voice dropped. "And I thought my brother a fool. For love? For ambition?" The word fell cleanly into the room. Marcus Fenwick gave a slight cough. "That is hardly kind, Miss Vale." "No," Beatrice said, turning on him. "But it is true. Julian liked rich rooms, rich women, rich possibilities. He told himself it was charm. Others called it calculation." Lady Evelina's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. Poirot inclined his head. "And did you, mademoiselle, benefit by his death?" Beatrice stared at him. "How dare you? With regret, but also necessity. My brother was all I had." "That is not an answer." For one moment grief and rage fought openly in her face. Then she said, "No, I do not benefit. Julian had debts, expectations, promises he could not keep. But money? No, he had almost none." "Debts to whom?" She hesitated. Poirot's voice became soft. "To whom, Miss Vale?" "To Mr. Fenwick." All eyes turned to the lawyer. Fenwick's face changed only slightly, but in that slight change Poirot saw the man beneath the varnish. "A private loan," Fenwick said. "Nothing improper." "How large?" asked Poirot. £5,000. Colonel Blenheim stopped pacing. "Good Lord, for what purpose?" Poirot asked. Fenwick adjusted his cuff. "Investment." Beatrice laughed bitterly. "Cards, horses, women. Choose whichever word sounds most respectable." Fenwick's lips thinned. "Mr. Vale assured me he would soon be in a position to repay the amount." "After his marriage," said Poirot. There was no answer. The fire snapped. Poirot turned to Lady Evelina. "Had you settled money upon your husband?" "No." "Were you about to?" "No." Fenwick looked up sharply. Lady Evelina noticed. A faint, cold amusement touched her mouth. "I see that disappoints you, Marcus. I am only surprised." "You were often surprised where my money was concerned." Mrs. Ashcombe stirred uneasily. "Evelina." "No, Celia. Mr. Poirot wishes truth. Let us give it to him." Lady Evelina looked directly at the lawyer. "Mr. Fenwick handled my late husband's affairs. He also advised me with great feeling never to remarry unless certain financial arrangements were made. I declined. Poirot's eyes rested on Fenwick. So if Mr. Vale lived, he might not have paid you. If he died, he certainly would not. Then I am hardly advantaged, Fenwick said, unless his death prevented a worse loss. Fenwick said nothing. Poirot moved his gaze to Dr. Graves. And you, Doctor, you spoke the toast. May the past rest quietly, a poetic phrase for a medical man. Dr. Graves looked tired. I knew Sir Edmund Harcourt. I attended him after his fall. His fatal fall from the south staircase? Yes. Was it an accident? Lady Evelina's head turned slightly. Dr. Graves took a long breath. At the inquest, yes. And privately? The doctor's jaw worked once before he answered. Privately, I had doubts. A silence gathered. Beatrice forgot her grief for a moment. Fenwick stopped touching his cuff. Mrs. Ashcombe closed her eyes. What doubts? Asked Poirot. Sir Edmund was not a clumsy man. The stairs were dry. There was no broken banister, no loose carpet. Yet he was found at the foot of the staircase with a white rose crushed in his hand. The room seemed to darken around the words. Poirot said gently, "A white rose." Dr. Graves nodded. "From Lady Evelina's wedding bouquet." Lady Evelina rose suddenly. "That is enough." But Poirot did not turn away. "No, madame. It is only beginning." Mrs. Ashcombe spoke then, very softly. "People said Evelina killed him." Lady Evelina faced her. "People included my friends, did they not?" Celia's eyes filled with pain. "I never believed it. You never said so aloud." The older woman flinched as if struck. Colonel Blenheim came to her defence. No one knew what to believe. Edmund was cruel when drunk. Half the county had heard him threaten you. "And therefore I became convenient," Lady Evelina said. "The cold young wife, the ambitious widow, the woman who did not weep properly." Poirot looked at her ring. "And tonight you wore mourning again. I wore memory. For Sir Edmund?" Her answer came after the smallest pause. "For myself." That pause interested Poirot more than the answer. At that moment the drawing-room door opened. Mrs. Morell stood there, black-clad and rigid. "Forgive me, my lady," she said. "Inspector Kelsey has arrived from the village." Poirot nodded. "In a moment." But the housekeeper did not go. Her eyes moved to Lady Evelina, then to the folded black veil. "There is something else, sir." "Yes. When the cake was brought from the pantry, there was a card beneath the silver tray. I thought it was from the baker." "And was it?" Mrs. Morell held out a small cream card. Poirot took it delicately. On it, written in a firm black hand, were 5 words. "For the bride who remembers." No one moved. Then Lady Evelina, for the first time that evening, lost every trace of colour. Poirot looked from the card to the assembled guests. "Mes amis," he said, "we begin to see. This wedding was not arranged for love. It was arranged for remembrance." Chapter 4. The White Rose. Inspector Kelsey of the Wiltshire Constabulary was a large, solemn man with a square jaw, damp boots, and the expression of one who had arrived too late at a house, but determined to mislead him. He listened in the library while Dr. Graves gave his first account of Julian Vale's collapse. He examined the broken champagne glass, the untouched wedding cake, and the sealed room of uneasy guests. Then he turned to Poirot with the cautious respect of an English policeman who had heard the name, but did not yet know whether to be grateful for it. "You believe the flower matters, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot stood beside the library table, where Julian's body lay under a linen sheet. Only the dead man's lapel remained uncovered. The white rose had been carefully removed and placed upon a porcelain saucer. "I believe," said Poirot, "that nothing so theatrical is accidental." Inspector Kelsey frowned at the rose. "Could poison be put on a flower?" "Many things can be put on many things, Inspector. Poison is not always swallowed from a glass. Sometimes it waits upon the skin. Sometimes it is carried by vanity, habit, affection." Poirot looked toward the closed door, or ceremony. Dr. Graves, pale under the lamplight, leaned closer. "If the petals were treated with something potent, and Vale touched them, then touched his mouth." "It would explain the speed," said Poirot. But who placed it in his buttonhole? That, Poirot replied, is the little question with the large teeth. The inspector ordered the rose wrapped and preserved. Poirot asked that Julian's gloves, handkerchief, glass fragments and collar be set aside as well. Then, leaving the doctor and police surgeon to their work, he requested a private view of the rooms used before the ceremony. They began in the small chapel. It was older than the house itself, built of pale stone darkened by centuries of candle smoke. The wedding flowers had already begun to droop in the damp air. Their perfume was faint and exhausted. At the altar lay a strip of ivory ribbon, fallen from some decoration. Poirot picked it up, studied the clean cut at one end, and laid it down again. "No white roses here," said Kelsey. "No," said Poirot. "Only lilies, myrtle, and pale chrysanthemums. Very correct, very expensive, very joyless. You don't like the arrangements? I do not dislike them. I merely observe that they have been chosen by someone who wished beauty without tenderness." Kelsey glanced at him, uncertain whether this was evidence or poetry. From the chapel they went to the morning room, where Julian had waited before the ceremony with Colonel Blenheim and Marcus Fenwick. A fire had burned low in the grate. On the table stood a decanter of sherry, 3 used glasses, and a silver box of cigarettes. Poirot touched nothing. He bent instead over the ashtray. "3 smokers," he murmured, "one impatient, one nervous, one careless." Inspector Kelsey blinked. "You can tell that?" "I can tell that one cigarette was crushed halfway through, one smoked down to the end, and one left to burn in the tray. Character, Inspector, reveals itself even in ashes." He moved next to a tall mirror near the mantelpiece. At its base, barely visible against the carpet, lay a small green thorn. Poirot knelt. "Ah." Kelsey came closer. "From the rose, possibly. A rose loses a thorn when a careless hand prepares it, or when a hurried hand forces it where it should not go." He lifted it with tweezers and placed it in an envelope. Then he saw the faint mark on the mirror. Not a fingerprint exactly, but a soft smear at shoulder height, as though someone wearing a glove had steadied themselves there. Poirot stood very still. In the reflection, the room behind him arranged itself into a neat little picture. The sherry, the fire, the chairs, the door to the corridor. He turned and looked at that door. Spectre. Who entered this room before the ceremony? Kelsey checked his notebook. Mr. Vale, Colonel Blenheim, Mr. Fenwick. The butler brought sherry. Mrs. Mirell came to say the chapel was ready. Miss Vale was seen outside but claims she did not enter. Claims? She says she came to warn her brother one last time, but heard him laughing and went away. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Laughter can be a locked door to grief. They found Beatrice not in the drawing room, but in the corridor near the south staircase, staring up toward the landing where Sir Edmund Harcourt had once fallen to his death. She turned when Poirot approached. "Have you come to accuse me?" "Not yet, mademoiselle. How polite. I try always to arrange things in order." Her mouth trembled, but she held herself upright. "You went to the morning room before the wedding," said Poirot. "I went to speak to Julian, but you did not enter." "No." "Why?" I heard him talking. "With whom?" She hesitated. "With Mr. Fenwick." "And what was said?" "I heard Julian say, 'After tonight, she will have no choice.' Then Mr. Fenwick said, 'Do not be too sure of that woman.'" Poirot's eyes sharpened. "That woman?" "Evelina. Did you hear anything else?" "Yes." Beatrice swallowed. Julian laughed and said, "The dead have been useful before. They may be useful again." For the first time, Poirot's face hardened. "Your brother was perhaps not a very kind man." "No," she whispered, "but he was my brother." That answer, naked in its sorrow, moved Poirot more than tears would have done. He left her and found Mrs. Mirell in the servants' hall, where she was giving instructions in a voice so controlled it had become almost mechanical. At Poirot's request, she led him to the pantry where the cake had been kept. The great black cake had stood there for only 20 minutes before being carried into the ballroom. The pantry smelled of sugar, wax, and cold stone. On the side table littered the silver cake knife, unused, its handle engraved with the Harcourt crest. Poirot looked not at the knife, but at the waste bin. Inside were scraps of ribbon, a torn bakery label, and 3 white rose leaves. Mrs. Mirel inhaled sharply when Poirot removed them. "These did not come from the wedding flowers," he said. "No, sir. Yet they were in the pantry. So it seems. Madame, do not fence with me. You knew of the old white roses." Her face became rigid. "Sir Edmund grew them in the west garden. After he died, my lady ordered the bushes cut down." "And were they?" "Yes." "All?" She looked away. Poirot waited. "There is one left," she said at last. "Against the old greenhouse wall. It should not have survived." "But it did. Some things do." The words were spoken with such quiet bitterness that Poirot studied her closely. "And who knew of this rose bush?" Mrs. Mirel's hands tightened around her keys. "Everyone who remembers Sir Edmund." Poirot returned to the ballroom alone. The cake still stood beneath the portrait, black and splendid, untouched by grief or fear. He walked around it slowly. The silver roses had been placed with extraordinary delicacy. Near the base, half hidden in the decoration, he saw something that made him stop. A tiny smear of white pollen. Not sugar, not dust, pollen. Poirot smiled sadly. "Ah, my friend Julian," he murmured. "You wore a flower from the past, but you did not know whose hand had cut it." Behind him, the ballroom door opened. Lady Evelina stood there without her veil now, her face bare and tired. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "if you are wise, you will leave Sir Edmund in his grave." Poirot turned. "Madame," he said. "That is precisely where someone has refused to let him remain." Chapter 5. The Secret Inside the Cake. The black wedding cake was cut shortly after midnight. Not for celebration, nor for hunger, nor even for custom. It was cut because Hercule Poirot insisted upon it. And because Inspector Kelsey, after one doubtful glance at the small Belgian's face, decided not to argue. The remaining guests were brought back into the ballroom. No one wished to return there. The room had acquired the peculiar chill of a place where people had behaved too politely before death entered, and too honestly after it. The long supper table stood abandoned, the candles burning lower now, their wax spilling down the silver holders like pale tears. The cake remained at the far end, beneath Sir Edmund's portrait. Lady Evelina stood nearest the fireplace, very straight, her hands clasped before her. Beatrice Vale had refused a chair and leaned instead against the wall, hollow-eyed but attentive. Marcus Fenwick looked annoyed, which in a lawyer so careful usually meant fear. Colonel Blenheim's face had gone dark with impatience. Mrs. Ashcombe sat quietly, but her gaze never left Lady Evelina. Mrs. Mirel and Hemsley stood by the servants' entrance, both summoned by Poirot's request. "Is this necessary?" asked Fenwick. "The man is dead. The cake is clearly a piece of melodrama, nothing more." "Melodrama, Monsieur Fenwick," said Poirot, "is often only truth that is dressed for dinner." Inspector Kelsey nodded to Hemsley. The old butler approached the cake table with the silver knife. His hand trembled so violently that the blade flashed in the candlelight. "Allow me," said Poirot. He took the knife with a small bow, as though accepting a dance. For a moment he regarded the cake in silence. Its black surface gleamed like polished jet. The silver roses curved delicately over the icing, beautiful and unnatural, flowers that had never known soil, rain, or decay. Then Poirot cut into the lowest tier. The knife went through the icing, sponge, and thick dark fruitcake beneath. A smell of brandy, spice, and burnt sugar rose into the room. Nothing happened. No gasp from the dead. No confession from the living. Poirot made a second cut, then a third. On the fourth, the knife struck something hard. A small metallic sound rang out. Beatrice flinched. Poirot carefully opened the cut portion with the edge of the blade. Embedded within the heart of the cake, wrapped in black waxed paper, lay a narrow silver box no longer than a lady's glove. Lady Evelina's face changed. Not much, but enough. "You knew?" asked Poirot softly. She did not answer. Inspector Kelsey stepped forward. "Open it." Poirot wiped the knife, then used its tip to lift the catch. The box opened with a faint click. Inside were 3 objects: a faded photograph, a folded letter, and a dried white rose, brown now with age, pressed flat as a secret no one spoke. Poirot lifted the photograph first. It showed a younger Lady Evelina standing in the west garden of Ravenshade Hall. Beside her stood Sir Edmund Harcourt, tall, handsome, and arrogant, even through the blur of time. Between them was another figure, a woman in a pale summer dress, her face half turned from the camera. Mrs. Ashcombe made a small sound. Poirot looked at her. "You recognise her?" Celia's lips parted. "That is Anne Mercer." The name struck the room strangely, not loudly, but deeply, as though it had fallen through a trapdoor in the floor. Beatrice looked confused. "Who was Anne Mercer?" "The companion," said Colonel Blenheim. His voice was rougher now. "Lady Evelina's companion in the early days of her first marriage." "More than companion," said Lady Evelina. Everyone turned to her. She looked at the photograph, not at them. "She was my friend." Poirot unfolded the letter. The ink had faded, but the handwriting remained firm, elegant, and hurried. He read silently at first. His expression did not alter. Yet something in the stillness of him made the others lean closer, without meaning to. Finally, he read aloud only one line. "If anything happens to me, Evelina must not be blamed. Sir Edmund knows that I saw him in the West Garden, Doctor." Graves, who had been standing near the door, closed his eyes. Inspector Kelsey said, "What does that mean?" "It means," said Poirot, "that before Sir Edmund died, someone else at Ravenshade was afraid." Lady Evelina spoke in a low voice. "Anne disappeared 2 weeks before Edmund's fall." "Disappeared?" Beatrice asked. "That was the word used. She had no family to question it. No money, no position. A note was found saying she had gone to London." Lady Evelina's mouth tightened. "I did not believe it." "And Sir Edmund?" asked Poirot. He laughed at me. Mrs. Ashcombe began to cry silently. Lady Evelina turned to her. "You knew, Celia. I suspected." "You did more than suspect." Celia Ashcombe's face crumpled with shame. "I was frightened. Edmund frightened everyone." The name seemed to move through the house like cold air under a door. Poirot looked again into the silver box. The dried rose had been tied with a narrow piece of ivory ribbon. Its thorns were still attached. "Who placed this box inside the cake?" asked Inspector Kelsey. Lady Evelina raised her chin. "I did." A stir passed through the room. Beatrice stared. "You?" "Yes." Fenwick took a step back, as if distance could protect him from the implications. Poirot said nothing. Lady Evelina's voice remained steady, but each word seemed to cost her something. "I ordered the black cake. Place the box inside it this afternoon before it was brought down. I intended to open it after the supper, before all of them." "All of whom?" asked Poirot. She looked at the faces around her. Those who knew, those who guessed, those who remained silent because silence was easier. Colonel Blenheim looked away. Dr. Graves did not move. Mrs. Ashcombe covered her face. Poirot nodded slowly. "So the wedding was not merely a wedding." "It was my opportunity," Lady Evelina said. "Julian wished to marry me. I permitted it. But tonight was never for him." Beatrice's grief twisted into disbelief. "You used my brother." Lady Evelina looked at her then, and for the first time there was pity in her face. "Your brother used me first." "What do you mean?" Before Lady Evelina could answer, Marcus Fenwick spoke. "This is absurd. Ancient letters, dead servants, emotional theatre. None of it explains Julian's murder." "No," said Poirot, "but it explains why someone was afraid of what would happen after the cake was cut." Fenwick's jaw tightened. Poirot turned back to the box. "Madame, did anyone know what you had hidden inside?" Lady Evelina hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. "Yes," said Poirot quietly. "Someone knew." Mrs. Morel stepped forward, her black dress rustling. "My lady told me to bring the box from the old escritoire." All eyes moved to her. "And after that?" asked Poirot. "I took it to the pantry." My lady placed it in the cake herself. "Were you alone?" Mrs. Morel's lips pressed tight. "No." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Who was there? The housekeeper looked toward the supper table, then toward the portrait of Sir Edmund. "Mr. Fenwick came in," she said. "He said he had papers for my lady to sign." Fenwick's face went white with fury. "That is a lie." Mrs. Morell's eyes burned. "No, sir. For once in this house, it is not." Poirot's gaze moved slowly to the lawyer, but before he could speak, Beatrice gave a sudden cry. She was staring at the dried white rose in the silver box. "That ribbon," she whispered. "Julian had a piece like it." Poirot became very still. "Where?" "In his pocket. Before the ceremony. I saw it when he took out his cigarette case." Poirot looked down at the ivory ribbon tied around the dead rose. Then he looked toward the library, where Julian Vale lay with another white rose no longer on his lapel. "Ah," he said softly. "So the past was not merely remembered tonight. It was copied. And somewhere outside, beyond the rain-dark windows, the last surviving white rose bush scraped against the old greenhouse wall." Chapter 6. Poirot cuts through the lies. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Hercule Poirot asked them all to return to the ballroom. By then the rain had softened to a whisper against the windows. But the wind still moved around Ravenshade Hall with a restless, searching sound. The candles had burned low. Their flames trembled in little pools of wax, casting the guests' shadows long and thin across the floor. The black wedding cake stood cut open beneath Sir Edmund Harcourt's portrait. It no longer looked like a wedding cake. It looked like a tomb that had been forced to give up its dead. Lady Evelina stood beside the fireplace. She had neither wept nor defended herself further. Yet something in her face had changed since the silver box had been opened. She looked less like a cold widow now, and more like a woman who had carried one unbearable truth for so long that even its exposure brought no relief. Beatrice Vale sat rigidly in a chair, her hands locked together in her lap. Mrs. Ashcombe was pale and miserable. Colonel Blenheim stared into the fire. Dr. Graves remained near the door, as though unwilling to step too deeply into the room's secrets. Marcus Fenwick stood alone near the supper table. That, Poirot noticed, was how guilt often arranged itself. Not always in hiding, but in careful isolation. Inspector Kelsey closed the doors. Poirot stepped into the centre of the room. "Mesdames and messieurs," he said, "tonight there have been 2 mysteries. The first, who killed Mr. Julian Vale? The second, why was this house made to remember a death from long ago?" Beatrice's voice was brittle. "I care only about the first." "Yes," said Poirot gently, "but the first cannot be understood without the second." He turned toward Lady Evelina. "Many years ago, Sir Edmund Harcourt died at the foot of the south staircase. Before that, a young woman named Anne Mercer disappeared. She had seen something in the west garden, something dangerous. A letter hidden tonight in the cake tells us she feared Sir Edmund." Lady Evelina's eyes closed briefly. Poirot continued. "Sir Edmund's death was ruled an accident. Lady Evelina was suspected, because she did not perform grief convincingly. But suspicion is not truth. Sometimes society condemns not the guilty, but the woman who refuses to faint beautifully." No one spoke. Tonight, Lady Evelina planned a revelation. The black cake was not a weapon. It was a stage. Inside it she placed the silver box, the photograph, the letter, the dried rose. She meant to expose what had been buried, that Anne Mercer did not simply run away, and that certain people in this room allowed that lie to live. Mrs. Ashcombe began to tremble. Poirot looked at her, but passed on. Unfortunately, someone learned of this plan. Someone who had reason to fear not only scandal, but ruin. Marcus Fenwick gave a thin laugh. "You are being theatrical yourself, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah, but I confess it openly." A faint movement touched Colonel Blenheim's mouth, then vanished. Poirot turned fully toward Fenwick. "You handled Sir Edmund's affairs. You also advised Lady Evelina after his death. You knew of documents, settlements, old payments. You knew enough to understand that Anne Mercer's disappearance might lead to questions. Questions about hush money, forged instructions, perhaps even a will altered after Sir Edmund's death. Fenwick's face hardened. "You have no proof." "Proof?" Poirot's eyes brightened. "But I have been collecting little proofs all evening. Let us begin with the rose." He lifted the preserved white rose, now wrapped in gauze, from a tray on the table. "Mr. Vale died because he touched this flower and then touched his lips. The petals had been treated with a fast poison. Dr. Graves will confirm the exact nature later, but the method is clear." Beatrice flinched. The flower came from the last surviving white rose bush in the west garden. The same garden connected to Anne Mercer and Sir Edmund. This was deliberate. The murderer wished the crime to look like the return of an old curse. Better still, he wished it to point toward Lady Evelina. Fenwick said, "Many people knew of that rose bush." "Yes, but not many lost a thorn from it in the morning room." Poirot held up a small envelope. "I found this thorn near the mirror in the room where Mr. Vale waited before the ceremony. A man preparing a boutonniere in haste may drop such a thing. He may also leave a faint glove mark on the mirror while leaning close to pin the flower properly." Fenwick shrugged. "That proves nothing against me." "No, alone. It proves only a flower was prepared there. So we add the ribbon." Poirot picked up the dried rose from the silver box. The old rose was tied with ivory ribbon. Miss Vale saw a similar ribbon in her brother's pocket before the ceremony. "Why?" "Because Julian Vale had been shown the contents of the box before the wedding." Lady Evelina looked sharply at Beatrice. Poirot nodded. Yes, Mr. Vale knew. He had not married blindly. He was part of a scheme. He intended to use Lady Evelina's revelation for profit. Fenwick's jaw twitched. Mr. Vale's debts were heavy. He owed money to Mr. Fenwick. He also knew that scandal at Ravenshade could be turned into pressure. "After tonight she will have no choice," he said. Miss Vale heard those words. But Mr. Fenwick understood something Mr. Vale did not. Poirot's voice became colder. Julian Vale was foolish. He thought secrets meant money. Mr. Fenwick knew they meant prison. Fenwick stepped back. "This is outrageous." "Is it?" "You entered the pantry when Lady Evelina and Mrs. Morel were dealing with the cake. You saw the box. You recognized what its contents might awaken. Then you saw your solution. If Julian died before the cake was opened, everyone would look first at Lady Evelina, then at the cake, then at the old legend of Sir Edmund. A black wedding cake, a mourning bride, a dead bridegroom. Magnifique, very dramatic, very useful." Inspector Kelsey moved slightly nearer to Fenwick. Poirot continued. "You needed a method that touched Julian alone. Champagne was too risky. Cake impossible because no one had eaten it. But a boutonniere? Personal. Elegant. Expected. You offered it to him in the morning room. Perhaps saying it would please Lady Evelina. Perhaps saying it came from the old Harcourt garden." Beatrice whispered, "Julian would have worn it for vanity." "Yes," said Poirot, "and for theatre. He liked theatre." Fenwick's voice cracked. "You cannot prove I gave it to him." Poirot looked toward Hemsley, standing pale by the servants' door. "The butler saw you leave the morning room carrying your gloves in your hand. Why remove gloves after merely speaking with the groom? Because you had used them while handling the poisoned flower." Fenwick laughed again, but it was no longer convincing. Servants imagine things. "Servants observe what their masters ignore," Poirot said sharply. "And there is more. When poison is placed upon petals, some trace may remain upon the fingers, the gloves, or the little silver pin used to fasten the stem. Inspector Kelsey has already taken your gloves from the cloakroom." "We shall see what science says." Fenwick said nothing. For the first time his composure had deserted him. Lady Evelina's voice cut through the silence. "You killed Julian to keep Edmund's secrets buried?" Fenwick turned on her with sudden ugliness. "You should have let the dead sleep." "No," she said. "That is what all of you told me when Anne vanished. That is what you told me when Edmund died. Sleep. Forget, behave. Be grateful no one hanged you with gossip." Mrs. Ashcombe broke down. "Evelina, forgive me." Lady Evelina did not answer. Poirot's face softened, but only for a moment. "Mr. Fenwick," he said, "you made one great mistake. You thought the black cake was the centre of the murder." but it was only the centre of attention. The true weapon was smaller, softer, and more intimate. Inspector Kelsey placed a hand on Fenwick's arm. The lawyer did not resist. He looked suddenly old, as if the house had taken back all the dignity it had lent him. Beatrice stood. Her face was white. Did Julian know what Fenwick had done? No, said Poirot. Your brother was guilty of greed, perhaps cruelty, but not of arranging his own death. It was not comfort, but it was something. The inspector led Marcus Fenwick from the room. No one followed. For a long while, only the rain spoke. At last Lady Evelina walked to the black wedding cake. She looked at the cut tier, the torn icing, the silver roses bent aside. Then she lifted the tiny silver wreath from the top and placed it beside the open box. For Anne, she said. Poirot bowed his head. And for Sir Edmund? Asked Colonel Blenheim quietly. Lady Evelina looked up at the portrait of her dead husband. No, she said. Sir Edmund has had quite enough. For the first time that night, Poirot smiled. Outside, beyond the wet glass and the dark garden, morning had not yet come, but somewhere in the old greenhouse wall, the last white roses trembled in the rain, and Ravenshade Hall, which had kept its secrets for so many years, seemed at last to exhale.
Like and subscribe our channel.